Okay, in this video, we are going to discuss about the risk management process. So, risk management process typically involves six steps. Yeah, 6 steps here: setting up the objective and policy. Secondly, identifying loss exposures. Third is measuring and evaluating risk. Fourth, selection of appropriate techniques to treat risk. Number 5, monitoring and review. And lastly, communication of risk management objectives and plans. So we see in the setting up objectives and policy, this is the first important step in the risk management process. The step of policies and objectives that are formulated will provide guidance for decision making in administrating the program. So that is why it is important to set the objectives and policies related to risk management. However, despite its importance, this step is often overlooked by an organization. As a result, the risk management program will be defective and implementation will be carried out in an inconsistent and disjoint manner. So having an objective and policies related to risk management is very important for guidance, for general guidance to the organization. So we have discussed earlier about the pre-loss risk management objective and the post-loss risk management objective. Yeah. The setting up of risk management policies and objectives is of paramount importance to organizations intending to adopt a risk management program. These policies and objectives would be embraced in the risk management policy statement so that the risk management philosophy and aspirations will transcend each member of the organization. Next is identifying loss exposures. One of the objectives and policies have been formalized after the company organization have underlined the objectives and the policies of risk management. Next steps that need to be taken by the organization is the risk management process to identify all major loss exposure. So this is the next important steps in risk management process, which is identifying the loss exposures. So this step will involve an acidos analysis of all potential losses, covering all aspects of losses. The risk identification process is a systematic and continuous approach to identify property, liability, and personal exposures towards the risk. So without this process, the organization will retain the risk by default. So without identifying the loss exposures, so there is a possibility for the institution to retain that kind of risk. To identify, because failure to identify loss might lead to the company retaining that risk, that kind of loss forever. Because the loss is actually do not come into the picture because it has not been analyzed properly. Without this process, to identify all potential losses, the risk manager needs a checklist of all the losses that could occur to any organization. So having a checklist is one of the easiest method for identifying risk and loss exposure. Checklists of potential losses are published by insurers and other related organizations. From this checklist, so the exposure will be classified into various categories, such as the direct tangible property exposures, indirect or consequential property exposures, net income exposures, and third-party liability exposures. So from there, they can understand what category of exposures, what category of loss exposures that might be faced by the organization. So according to the type, for example, you can see here the tangible, direct tangible property, indirect and consequential property, and then net income matters related to their income, then also matters related to third party liability. Various methods have been suggested as risk identification tools that can be maximized or used by the risk managers to identify various types of loss exposures found in an organization. So these methods are, for example, physical inspection. Yeah, doing a physical inspection to its various facilities, plants, and operations. So from there, the company, the organization can detect various major and minor loss exposure that can be happen in one property that owned by the institution. For example, kalau ada retak ke, ada kerosakan, ya. So that is all the potential losses yang boleh berlaku. And then doing the financial statement analysis, from an analysis of the balance sheet, income statements, and statements of sources and uses of funds, the risk manager would be able to identify all the assets, liability, and personnel exposures of the organization and the potential losses that are associated with them. Yeah. So to strengthen this analysis, so one of the things that can be done is actually doing the financial statement analysis in order to identify the potential loss exposures. And then it can be also done, the process of risk identification can also be done through risk analysis questionnaires. Using this method, the risk manager will be able to secure in an organized manner vital information about the organization's assets, operations, and expected liabilities. So from the data collected, the risk management can then picture the corresponding loss exposures, and be able to respond to them in the future. So that is why it is important. Although in our daily life also we need to have some sort of checklist of our assets. Sebab tu kita kena tahu bila insurance kereta kita tamat, bila road tax tamat. So kalau kereta kita for example tak ada insurance, tak ada road tax, so kita selalu terdedah pada risiko kalau berlaku kemalangan for example. So in that case, if we have the insurance coverage still on, so we can claim from the insurance. But if we do not have it, or the insurance have expired, so that we will have problems, and we will incur additional financial loss to repair our vehicle. Same goes to the company as well. So for a company, they have a very large amount of assets, any plants, factory, buildings. So that's why they need to have a proper checklist to understand to identify the exposure. And then it can be done through a flow chart as well. Risk identification method or tools can be done through a flow charts. The flow charts can show a risk management, the organization's operational structure, and the process from beginning to end. So this will help the risk management to detect disruption points, bottlenecks, and potential accidents that could disrupt the organization's activities and subsequently the production of the company. And then risk identification can also be identified through a previous loss data. So of course, previous loss data is very important. So we learn from our history, our previous history. So all these previous loss data should be taken also into consideration, so that the company will not doing the same mistakes at the future date. And then last but not least is through interview and interaction with other departments. This is to build up a good risk management information system. So the risk manager needs to elicit information through systematic and continuous interactions with other departments within the organization, as well as external experts. So it can be done with either through structured interviews and whatnot. So in practice, which one is the preferred tools for risk identification? So the answer is, in practice, the preferred approach for risk identification is a combination of the approach mentioned above. So each of these tools can identify one or more loss exposures. However, when we combine the techniques and the tools, the risk management manager will be able to identify the various risks facing the organization. The next process of risk management is after we have identified the loss. So how do we measure and evaluate the risk? So this is a stages process. So from setting up the objective and then identifying the loss exposure, and then the next step after identifying the loss exposure, so the organization need to measure and evaluate the risk. Risk evaluation is the process of assessing the likelihood of a risk happening, the adequacy of existing controls and the consequences of the risk, and the ability of the affected party to manage the risk. So that's why it's important to identify first the risk, or identify the exposure of loss first, and then afterwards only we can measure and evaluate the potential risk. When we evaluate and assess the risk, so we can from there we can understand the likelihood of the risk to happen, and then whether we have an adequate controls on that risk or not, and then what is the consequences of the risk, and also the ability of the affected party to manage that risk. So risk evaluation involves estimating the severity and frequency of risk exposures and ranking them according to their relative importance. It's important to rank the risk exposure so that we can take extra precaution on things or loss exposures that have higher probability. Risk frequency refers to the number of times a loss producing events will occur during a given time period. So risk severity refers to the cost of amount of loss in money terms arising from a loss producing events. So those risk exposure with high level of potential losses will be given primary focus. So this is like some sort of like a priority. So which type of loss exposure should be given priority by the organization. Yeah? So any exposure, risk exposure which have high level of potential losses, this type of risk exposure will be given the primary focus for the organization. So the severity of a risk is multiplied by the likelihood of the risk occurring in order to get the level of risk. This will determine which risk will be treated and which risk will be accepted. That's why it is important in measuring and evaluating this. So we will know which type of risk need treatment and which one we can just accept it and let it go like that. For example, certain high risk may be accepted by a takaful operator as their impact can be limited through retakaful surplus or catastrophic treaties, as well as through adjustment of contract wordings where possible. So the quantification of risk in some takaful cases can be extremely difficult, but on an intuitive basis, an example is like what we can see in the example which exists in the books. Yeah, I will not explain in details the examples, but this is some of the examples which are available. Next, we move on to the selection of appropriate techniques to treat risk. Yeah? As has been noted earlier, the risk management is essentially a process that integrates methods of risk control and risk financing. Therefore, the risk manager has a variety of alternative approaches to handling risk. To control risk, for instance, the risk manager could choose any or a combination of the following methods. Yeah. So there are different methods to treat risk. Whether it can be a risk avoidance, risk combination, we have discussed this earlier in the previous lecture. loss prevention, contractual transfer of risk control, whether if they can accept the risk, absorbing loss as they come, or current expensing of losses. Yeah, so we have discussed all these things. The rules of risk management. It is recommended that the following set of rules to be taken into consideration when deciding on the appropriate tool to employ. So the first one is, do not risk more than you can afford to lose. So this is important because it tells us which risk about which something must be done. We have to look at the maximum potential loss of the risk. If it is large and perhaps to an unbearable degree, then the possible severity must be reduced to a manageable level, or the risk must be transferred. So if you cannot afford to lose, if you could not afford to lose that kind of risk, so do not involve in that. And then the second rule of risk management is consider the odds. It suggests that the likelihood or probability of loss may be an important factor in deciding what to do about a particular risk. It provides guidance on those risks that it should not be insured. Yeah. And then the last rules of risk management is, do not risk a lot for a little. So it indicates that there should be a reasonable relationship between the cost of transferring risk and the value that accrues to the transferor. So it provides guidance in two directions. First, a risk should not be retained when the possible loss is large. So if through measurement of or measuring in evaluating risk, we found out that the possible loss is large, so and relative to the premium saved, so it's better just to not to retain that kind of risk. On the other hand, there are instances where the premium required to insure a risk is disproportionately high relative to the risk transferred. In such cases, the premium is high while the possible loss is low. So kalau kita transfer risiko tu, tapi cost transfer tu lebih tinggi daripada kesan kerugian yang akan kita hadapi disebabkan risiko tu, so baik tak payah transfer risiko tersebut lah. So just accept it. So that's what we call it as a rule of risk management. And then we move on to the risk characteristics that determine the choice of techniques. So in order for the purpose of selection of the techniques, so there are several risk characteristics that can help the organization to determine the choice of techniques. Some risks should be transferred and shared, while some retained and some avoided and eliminated. What risk characteristics determine which approach should be used? So given the situation, the characteristics of the risk itself will determine which of the available tools is most appropriate. Besides the appropriateness of the tool, cost should also be a point of consideration. So that is very important. In risk management, cost is very important as a point of consideration, so that the organization is able to achieve the financial security desired at a minimum cost. So when we want to decide how to treat a risk, so consideration on cost is very important, so we could manage the risk at a very minimum cost. Based on the discussion above, we can summarize the relationship between the risk and the risk corresponding treatments. So you can see the risk metric. If we have high severity but and high severity and high frequency, so you can look in the books. If we have high severity and high frequency, so we can just avoid and reduce. What we can do the action that we can use to treat the risk is actually avoid the risk or reduce the risk. Avoid and reduce. But if we have high severity and low frequency of the occurrence, so what we can do is we take the takaful or insurance. High severity, for example, the cost of having that kind of risk is very high, but the frequency of it happening is very low. For example, like um, being admitted in the hospital, yeah, being admitted in hospital. So the cost in that we will incur when we being admitted in hospital, in a private hospital, is very high. The cost is very high, but the frequency is very low. So for example, like me, I subscribe to the medical card. So it has been like, I think, like 4 or 5 years, yeah, 4 or 5 years, but not a single time I've been admitted to the hospital. So the frequency of it happening, the risk happening, is very low. So in that case, so takaful or insurance is just is the option in managing that kind of risk. But in the case if we have a low severity, but the frequency is very high, so in this case, whether we can take a retention approach or reduction approach. The method or the way that we can treat the risk is whether we risk retention or we take reduction of risk. And then if we have a low severity but low frequency, so we can just do a risk retention, yeah. The best way to manage the risk would be retention. So in this instance, the risk seldom occurs, and when they do happen, the financial impact is relatively small. So we just let it go, like some sort of like that, lah. Relationship. So the next activities is the monitoring and review. So monitoring and review. Effective risk management requires a reporting and review structure to ensure that risks are effectively identified and assessed, and that appropriate controls and response are in place. Yeah? So after we have identified, and then we have measure and evaluate the risk, and then we make selection of techniques that can be taken to treat the risk. Next is the process of monitoring and review of the action that has been taken. Regular audits and policy and standards compliance should be carried out, and standard performance reviewed to identify opportunities for improvement. So this is the purpose. Yeah. So monitoring and review is conducted through regular audits and compliance. So the objective of having the audit is actually to identify opportunities for improvement by the organization. It should be remembered that organizations are dynamic and operate in dynamic environment. Changes in an organization and the environment in which it operates must be identified, and appropriate modifications made to systems. So after after treatment of risk has been taken, so it is important to monitor it so that any changes that need to be done, any modification that need to be undertaken should be monitored and highlighted in this process. The monitoring process should provide assurance that there are appropriate activity controls in place for the organization and that the procedures are understood and followed. The monitoring and risk review stage will include the production of risk reports, claim performance reports, and experience studies and audits, as well as audit reporting. So it is quite possible that different risks will have different types of monitoring, with investment risk in particular monitored on a more frequent basis and reported directly to the management and board of directors. So all these monitoring and review processes, the detailed report will be submitted and deliberated in the management meeting and also the board of directors. Certain type of risk will require frequent monitoring and frequent reporting apart from the normal requirement by the institutions. The actions in this stage ensure that specified management action plans remain relevant and updated. Yeah, so after the audit and compliance has been taken, so action will be taken by the organization, maybe to improve its daily operation, and then any action plan can be taken and updated accordingly. Any monitoring and review process should also determine whether the measures adopted resulted in what is intended. So after treatment of risk has been taken, so we need to understand whether the adoption of the treatment is adequate or not to manage that risk. So if it is not adequate, or if it did not resulted in what is intended, so further action should be taken into place. The procedures adopted and information gathered for undertaking the assessment are appropriate, and the improved knowledge has helped the organization to reach better decision. So monitoring and review process should also identify lessons that can be learned for future assessment and management of risk. Yeah. So that's why the process of monitoring and review is very important. And last but not least, the communication of risk management objectives and plan. So during all phases of risk management, communication between all parties is vital. It is important. It is often said that it is not the plan which is important, but the planning itself is important. This is very true in this case, meaning that the proper communication throughout all phases of the risk management planning is needed. That's why the need for communication is often, sometimes, the need for communication is often ignored, and usually as a result, compromise choices are made, leading to the objective of the plan not being achieved. Yeah. So if communication is not being conducted or being given emphasized by the organization, so this is the problem. Uh, the objective of the plan could not be achieved. So if the objective could not be achieved, so it will lead the risk which faced by the organization is still available or still exists. The drivers of risk can be grouped into two categories: internal and external sources of risk. These sources of risk will need to be observed in light of risk management. For example, strategic risks are forces which may affect the strategic objectives of a takaful operation. These risks, sometimes known as business risks, can be affected by external forces such as the national and global economies as well as government policies. Yeah. On the other hand, operational risks are internal and are inherent in the ongoing activities that are performed by the takaful operation, which includes data management activities, underwriting activities, retakaful activities, claim department activities, marketing and sale activities. So these are risks associated with the day-to-day operational performance of staff. Procedures and organizational structure, for example, are inherent in the manner in which core operations are performed. Risk management is a continuous process which runs throughout the development and implementation of the organization risk management strategy. And risk management has to be integrated into the organization culture. So that's why the communication is very important whenever each each result has been taken by the management. So it and endorsed by the board of directors. So the decision have to be communicated to all relevant parties within the
within the organization, so that everybody have the same understanding on what is actually the objective and plan taken for risk management on each and every specific issues related to the risk. So hence, during all phases of risk management, open communication between all of the concerned parties is vital. So that the objective is that so that everybody is having the same understanding, the same knowledge of what need to be done in order to manage certain type of risk. Yeah. So I think that's all for our discussion related to the risk management takaful, and then I will attach in the goals uh, one part of relationship between risk management and takaful. The topic number 5, this one I will upload it in the goals. Okay, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.